Today we've got some really timely source material. It's mostly centered around a recent interview with Vice President JD Vance, and it touches on two major global flashpoints.
Right. We're looking at the U.S. stance on Russia-Ukraine, which is, well, really flipped recently, and also the state of play with the Gaza ceasefire talks. Very delicate stuff.
Absolutely. So we're going to unpack this first, the big reversal on Ukraine policy, and then we'll get into where things stand apparently with Gaza.
Yeah, and the sources, they really show two different kinds of diplomacy happening at once. Ukraine is like this hard pivot, a really public shift. Gaza, that's more of a diplomatic grind, Behind the scenes, very careful language.
Okay, so our mission here is to figure out the why behind that Ukraine pivot and maybe try to quantify just how optimistic the administration actually is about Gaza.
Exactly, based on what Vance is saying. All right, let's dive straight into the first big piece. Ukraine. Vance is now arguing that Russia needs to negotiate. What's the evidence he's using? What's the rationale? Well, he's really leaning on metrics of failure, essentially. He points out pretty bluntly that the Russian economy is, quote, in shambles.
In shambles. Okay, that's strong wording. Is that like a political line, or is there solid data backing that up? I mean, how bad is shambles?
That's a fair question. The interview itself doesn't dive into specific GDP numbers or anything, but it's a powerful phrase, right? Politically useful. It connects what he presents as military failure, which might be easier to see, to economic pain.
And the military side.
He pairs it directly. He says the Russians are not gaining much on the battlefield. So the picture he paints is one of stalled military effort plus economic damage. So the argument is, negotiate now, because you're losing ground. The human cost is mounting. The economic cost is mounting. You're running out of leverage. It's less moral, more strategic pressure. Precisely. And this leads directly to placing the blame for the continued conflict squarely on Moscow. According to Vance, they're the ones refusing to talk seriously.
Refusing how, though? Does he get specific about the type of talks?
He does, yeah. He says they've refused to sit down with any bilateral meetings with Ukrainians. Okay. Maybe not surprising. But he adds they've also refused to sit down with any trilateral meetings.
Ah, okay. And why is that trilateral part important for listeners to understand?
Well, bilateral is just Kyiv and Moscow, often deadlocked. Refusing trilateral talks suggests they're rejecting a third party, maybe the U.S., maybe Turkey, someone who could actually mediate, structure the conversation.
Right, someone neutral-ish to broker a real process.
Exactly. So refusing that signals, in Vance's framing, that they're not serious about peace under current conditions, even though, as he puts it, they don't have a lot to show for it. It basically shifts all the diplomatic pressure onto Russia.
Okay, so let's really unpack the shift itself. Because compared to where things were, say, 6 months ago, this is, well, it's a huge change.
Huge is putting it mildly. It's almost a 180. If you go back to February, after a meeting then, President Trump and Vance were reported to have sharply criticized Zelenskyy.
Right, and the argument back then was totally different. It was almost like the U.S. was blaming Kyiv.
Yeah, somewhat. The line was that continued U.S. support was giving Kyiv undue leverage. The implication was that maybe Zelenskyy wasn't serious about talks because he had U.S. backing.
And didn't they even suggest Kyiv should be ready to give up territory?
They did. Earlier comments definitely hinted that Kyiv should prepare to concede lost territory just to end the fighting. It was basically telling the victim of aggression to compromise.
Okay, so that's the old stance. Now, fast forward to the recent UN General Assembly meeting between Trump and Zelenskyy. This is where it gets really interesting. What was the message there?
Completely different tone.
Yeah.
Total support, almost bullish confidence. Trump pledged continued U.S. weapons support for NATO partners. That's maybe expected. But then he escalated.
How so?
He called on NATO allies to intercept Russian aircraft violating their airspace.
Whoa. Okay, that's not just support. That's encouraging direct confrontation, potentially, right on the border. A massive signal. A massive signal. And then the biggest piece, the overall strategic goal. The president expressed heightened confidence in Ukraine's ability to resist, saying Ukraine could not only win the war, but potentially retake occupied areas.
Right, sorry.
Retake occupied areas. So going from prepare to concede territory to we think you can actually win it all back.
Exactly. It's giving Kyiv the green light, publicly, to aim for total victory, a complete departure from those earlier warnings.
And the justification, going back to Vance's points, is that this isn't just wishful thinking. It's based on Russia's perceived failures on the ground and economically.
That's the connection they're making, yes. The argument is the facts on the ground now support this more aggressive, optimistic stance. The data supposedly backs the rhetoric.
Yeah, okay, so if you're expressing that much confidence, And you're Zelenskyy.
Hmm.
You're going to ask for the tools to make it happen. What was reportedly top of his list at that UN meeting. The sources mention a specific request. U.S. Tomahawk, long-range missiles. Tomahawks. Okay, those are serious strategic weapons, game changers potentially.
Potentially, yeah. They allow strikes deep behind enemy lines, command posts, supply depots. If you actually want to shift from defense to offense and retake large areas, that's the kind of capability you'd want.
So the U.S. says, we have heightened confidence you can win it all back, and Zelenskyy says, okay, great, give us the Tomahawks to do it. What was Vance's answer when he was asked if he'd support sending them?
He didn't commit. He very carefully deferred, said it was up to the president.
Deferred. So no immediate yes, despite the win the war rhetoric, no. He gave this standard sort of catch-all justification. What the president will do is what's in the best interest of the United States of America. So we think you can win, we encourage you to try, but whether we give you the best tools for the job depends on our interests, not necessarily just on enabling your victory. That sounds contradictory.
It does highlight a tension, doesn't it, between the public rhetoric of full support and the actual practical decisions on providing specific weapon systems.
So what's the calculation there? Fear of escalation, worries about depleting U.S. stockpiles, domestic politics.
Probably a mix of all of those. Escalation management is almost certainly a huge factor. Providing weapons that can strike deep into Russia itself carries significant risks the U.S. wants to manage.
Right.
And yeah, these high-end systems are expensive, they're finite, there's always a calculation about U.S. readiness versus supporting an ally. It basically shows that the win-the-war rhetoric has limits.
Limits defined by U.S. self-interest and risk assessment. The U.S. cheers for victory, but still wants to control the tempo, control the escalation ladder.
That seems to be the takeaway. The decision-making remains firmly filtered through what Washington sees as best for the U.S., not just what's fastest or best for Kyiv's immediate goals.
Okay. Let's pivot now. Completely different region, completely different diplomatic challenge. Let's talk about the Gaza ceasefire negotiations. What's the latest status update from Vance?
Yeah, shifting gears entirely. Here, the language is all about nuance and fragility. Vance expressed cautious optimism about getting an agreement between Israel and Hamas.
Cautious optimism, the classic diplomatic hedge, means maybe, but don't hold your breath.
Pretty much. It signals some movement, but manages expectations because, well, these talks are incredibly volatile. But he did suggest they think they're genuinely close.
How close? Did he give any indication?
He used a very striking metaphor. He said, I think the president has gotten us to a point where we are at the 1-yard line.
The 1-yard line. Wow. Okay, that implies, like, 99% done, just punching it in.
That's the implication, yeah. That the main framework, the big pieces, are possibly agreed upon, and it's down to the final details. He even said he's more optimistic than at any point.
But, I mean, anyone who follows this knows that final yard in Middle East negotiations can be like a minefield. The hardest part?
Absolutely. And Vance acknowledges that immediately. He adds the crucial warning, the caveat.
Which is?
He says, quote, let's be realistic. These things can get derailed at the very last minute. That brings it back down to earth.
Right, because derailed at the last minute is practically the theme song for Israeli-Palestinian talks sometimes. What are those likely last-minute sticking points at the 1-yard line?
Usually it's the really sensitive stuff. The exact numbers and identities of prisoners or hostages to be released, the precise mechanisms for verifying the ceasefire holds, guarantees about future actions, how humanitarian aid gets in and who controls it. Any single one of those could blow the whole thing up.
Yeah, the difference between a temporary pause and something potentially more lasting, that's often where it falls apart. So close, but incredibly fragile. That's the picture. Cautious optimism, balanced by the very real risk of sudden collapse, the 1-yard line, but with fumbles being extremely common. Okay, so let's try and bring these two threads together. We've got this major policy reversal on Ukraine, seemingly driven by performance metrics, and then this extremely tense, fragile 1-yard line situation in Gaza. What are the big takeaways for you listening to this?
Well, I think there are two key things here. First, on Ukraine, the U.S. policy shift isn't arbitrary. It's being explicitly framed as performance-based. The move from pushing compromise to backing victory is tied directly, rhetorically at least, to Russia's perceived military and economic failings. U.S. confidence rises as Moscow struggles.
Okay, performance dictates policy, or at least the public posture.
Right. And second, for Gaza, it's all about this high-risk, high-wire act of diplomacy. The administration thinks it's incredibly close, 1-yard line, close, but everyone involved knows that the final, most sensitive details could still cause a complete breakdown at any second. Optimism is there. but is heavily caveated.
So here's maybe the final thought for you listening to all this. We see these political figures explicitly linking policy like boosted confidence in Ukraine to concrete things they can point to, like battlefield stalemate or an economy in shambles. They're using metric to justify shifts.
Yeah, it's very direct. So the question to mull over is, how much does that actual measurable performance of another country and adversary directly control public statements, the aid strategy, even the war aims promoted by the U.S. government? If Russia suddenly started making major gains again, would that win the war talk just evaporate? Would we be back to concede territory? It seems like the policy might be more reactive to performance than we sometimes think. Something to watch. That's a really crucial point. How much is strategy versus reaction?
Definitely something to keep an eye on. Anyway, thanks for walking us through this source material. Fascinating stuff.
Always interesting. Thanks.
All right, we'll catch you on the next deep dive.